please welcome Mariam.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Mariam, and this past summer I spent working with Simtable on this project, and I'm currently a student at the United World College down by Las Vegas. So the project is called ROSA, or Rate of Spread Analysis, and as just mentioned, it's about estimating wildfire rates of spread from observed perimeters using raster-based interpolation methods. So just a bit of background, which y'all might already know. Fire spread, we can basically say, is a series of successive ignitions. So whatever fire already exists is going to heat up the material around it until it combusts. And this happens at a variety of different rates depending on that material and other factors. But those will all combine into what we call a quasi-steady state rate, which can be observed for real-life fires and referred to as the rate of spread. So this is essentially the speed at which a fire spreads and is super useful for evaluating fire danger, predicting behavior, doing simulations, or planning prescribed burns. And so how has this been calculated? So in 1971, Franzen showed that rate of spread is a ratio between heat flux received, which is the top half of that equation, and the heat required for ignition by the potential fuel, which is the bottom half of that equation. Then the year after that, Rothermel used this to develop a semi-empirical model for rate of spread. And the parameters are fuel moisture, particle size, and packing ratio, which you can see in that bottom with those fuel variables, as well as wind speed and slope, which are in the top as that wind parameter and slope parameter. So since the calculation relies so heavily on fuel data, fuel models were developed, and these basically help map observations of landscape to inputs for the models. So that means you could look at lumber and or like a patch of grass and say, okay, these are probably the approximate values, and use that to input into the model and use for planning. So what was our project? It was essentially using time of arrival rasters, which were generated from fire perimeters to calculate the rate of spread, and then compare that to the predicted rates by looking at what fuel and slope was in that area and perform some observation-driven modeling. So on the very left, you can see those are the fire perimeters. In the middle is the time of arrival raster, and then on the right are the various rasters that we generated from this. So the first step was to gather fire perimeter data. We looked at the continental US and took large fires with super detailed boundaries, and also made sure they had a well-defined origin so that we could get some good time of arrival rasters, and we also took out any bad or conflicting data. And in the end, we got 15 sets of clean files, and the list of fires we used is on the bottom. You can see there from 2018 up until 2024. Once we had these rasters, we could generate, once we had these perimeters, we could generate the time of arrival rasters. So because the perimeters were timestamped, we could use bidirectional flood fill to interpolate between the perimeters and get an approximation of where the fire was at each time value. And then encode that using RGB values, which you can see kind of right below the text. But once we did this, we saw that there was a slight issue, and we decided to switch from using a Manhattan to Euclidean distance metric in order to get smoother rate values. So if you look on the right side of the screen, you can see the Manhattan distance. I don't know how well it shows up on the projector, but there's kind of like these large rectangle shapes where it filled in using that Manhattan distance. But compared to the Euclidean, it's much more smooth and rounded and just kind of flows more naturally like something would in the real world. So that's what we ended up using for the rest of the analysis. Then the next step, once we had the arrival times, is to calculate rate. And this rate is basically a speed, right? So we just kind of use a distance over time formula. But there were 3 different ways which we tried using this. The first one is a Sobel operator method, just basically calculating the gradient or the slope to get a magnitude and direction. And that method considers all the surrounding cells, so it's kind of like an average in a way. We also tried a least recent neighbor method, and this looks at the surrounding cells for each time of arrival and assumes that the fire has spread from the neighboring cell, which has been burning the longest. So since it's the longest amount of time and that goes on the bottom, then that results in the slowest rate of spread. And that's that image in the middle on the left. And then we also looked at a most recent neighbor method, which assumes that the fire spread from the neighboring cell, which has been burning the shortest. And this results in the fastest rate of spread. And then that's the raster on the bottom left-hand corner. And you can see there are these like intense patches of white which show like very extremely high rates. So because of this, we ended up going with the least recent neighbor for the rest of the results in the following slides. So once we had those time of arrival and rate values, we could fetch some associated values. So we got fuel data, which is on the very left with the different color-coded fuels, as well as elevation, which is those purple and green rasters. And from the elevation, we could use a Sobel operator to get values for slope and aspect in degrees. And then you might be thinking, don't fires burn differently in different regions? So how can we kind of analyze them all the same? And so that is where clustering comes in. So we used rate of spread over time histograms to compare the different fires and cluster them. And this meant using a sum of squares distance metric with the equation shown there, as well as k-means clustering to really get us the 6 clusters on the right with Smokehouse Creek, County, Woolsey, South Sugarloaf, Delta and Carr, and then all of the rest of them. And this gives us the following graphs. So the top kind of row is rate of spread versus time, and then the middle is rate of spread versus slope, and then kind of some analysis. So if we look at the Smokehouse Creek fire, we can see that it has the slope doesn't have much of an impact on it. And we can kind of see that that's because it's a fast-moving, highly wind-driven fire. There's also some diurnal fire activity, which we can see in the rate of spread versus time graph, where the fire activity and rates drastically change between night and day. And this is the most unique fire out of the set, and we actually removed it from the rest of the values in the following slides. Then the County and Woolsey fires both show an expected relationship between rate of spread and slope magnitude. When the slope magnitude is higher, the rate of spread will also be higher, because at the fire, or the material at the lower elevation burns, and then the hot air rises and dries out the fuel above, so it's able to spread faster in that direction. So that is the expected relationship for the County and Woolsey fire. But then for the next 3 fires, we kind of see not exactly what we would expect, which sort of indicates that other variables are bigger drivers of the fire than the slope. So for South Sugarloaf, that could be fuel type and terrain. For Delta and Carr, that could be, again, fuel type and terrain. And then for all the other ones, they're kind of slow-paced and steady fires, and there's not really a meaningful trend from rate of spread versus slope. Next, we looked at fuels, and we took some representative rates from the original Anderson study, giving these fuel types, and we looked at the average rate of spread versus those representative rates. And by ordering in terms of fastest to slowest, we could see that the order is nearly identical. But if you look at the values, the average rate of spread, it's kind of between 4 and 8 or 9. Well, the representative rates are between 8 and 100, so there's sort of a clear difference there. And that could be due to the way that we calculated things, looking in all directions as opposed to just in the direction of the wind or the heading of the fire. And now to further look at slope, on the left is a graph from a 2007 Butler and Anderson study showing almost what seems like an exponential relationship between slope and rate of spread. But when we look at the average values from our calculations with this method, it's completely different. But when we look at how rate of spread direction and slope direction align, we can see some more slope-driven behavior. So that little bump in the center is essentially when the way that the fire was spreading aligned with how the slope was, or the direction the slope was facing. So that shows a more clearly slope-driven behavior. However, there are some limitations and issues with these conclusions. So first of all, there's a very small data set. We only used 15 different fires, and it was unrepresentative of the full range of fuel and slope values. Beyond this, distinguishing between surface spread and spotting behavior was not incorporated. We just kind of assumed everything was the same. And similarly for wind, we kind of used as a hidden variable and didn't really consider it in our analysis. Beyond that, obviously these fires were huge and very impactful in their communities, so they were going to be containment measures by firefighters, but we don't really know exactly where that was, where they might have dug a trench or something like that to prevent spread in one direction, so that can also influence these values. And then, kind of as I briefly mentioned in the last slide, rate of spread was originally intended for the main axis or heading of the fire rather than spread in all directions. So when there are those representative values, that's more for assuming the fastest direction they can spread rather than how we were taking it average in all directions. And then as I touched on talking about our rate of spread calculations, the way both the Sobel and the least recent neighbor sort of naturally results in slower spread rates, which can again explain those differences between representative and actual average rates. So now just to briefly touch on some possible applications of this method, which creates a collection of rate of spread data and its associated influences. This could be used to look at fire behavior changes. So fire behavior has changed in recent history, as I'm sure you all know, due to climate change, as well as historical fire suppression. And with this method, we could analyze a larger group of fires over a long time period to confirm if or how rates have changed in recent history. It could also have use in simulations, where adjustment factors can be applied to the rate of spread calculations to help reduce differences between simulated and real fires. And then another possible application is with fuel models. So fuel modeling and mapping is complicated by variability and estimation and biotic influences, and this can lead to inaccurate fire spread simulations. But this rate of spread method could be used with different fuel models and mapping techniques to evaluate their predictability. So in conclusion, the graphs we saw show that slope doesn't, in the real world with in all directions, doesn't seem to increase rate of spread by as strong as a factor as previously shown experimentally and in a lab environment. Additionally, rate of spread on average may be lower than those given by fuel models. Also, clustering was very crucial to generating more meaningful data and would benefit if a larger data set was analyzed. But then there are many limitations and a lot of approximations and averaging, and so these conclusions cannot be taken without a consideration of this, but there are still a lot of potentially useful applications for this method of rate of spread analysis. So yeah, thank you, and please let me know if there are any questions.
We've got some time for questions. I'd like to prime the pump. We're learning across wildfires, especially that last for 10 days to 3 months, that burn periods are really influential. And when you're averaging the effective slope up or down, that sort of thing, the burn periods give us very different relationships between the fire behavior response and the covariates, the variables that are actually driving it. Is it possible to take these methods and apply it to burn days of individual fires?
Yeah, I think so, and especially, one thing, I guess it might be kind of hard to see on these graphs because they're a little small, but with these rate of spread versus time graphs, the slope is, the time on the bottom is as a percent, so we can kind of see the different phases of the fire, in the first 10% of the fire, then this behavior looks like this, and especially in these two, it's very high at first, and then it's much, much lower. So yeah, this could definitely be used to look at different burn days.
Very cool. Other questions for Mariam?
I understand that, first of all, this is an incredible accomplishment. Do you envision some way to employ the key variable of wind in your future studies? Do you have a path to do that, or have you thought about that?
Yeah, I think there could be a potential path for that. I think it's quite hard. I did a little bit of work with it and trying to fetch some wind data and see how it compared. But just with the time that I was working on this, I did not fully incorporate it, but I can definitely see that happening in the future if there was a comprehensive wind data set that could be fetched from.
Well, I think one start might be, I've been lectured several times that wildfires produce their own wind also. So maybe limiting the first installment of what wind to look at might be something along that line. So just a comment. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know what I'm doing, by the way.
All right. We're out of time.
All right,
Please
thank you.
thank